Hello and welcome to another video from the only source of information that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse, but actually enjoy it. And today we're going to be talking about a Bible verse that pretty much everybody is familiar with, but probably most people don't realize that it's a Bible verse, because this verse of the Bible was quoted by Abraham Lincoln, and so most people associate what we're going to talk about with him and not with Jesus, who was the first person to say it. So anyways, the reason we're going to even be discussing this is because a lot of Christendom's religions recognize that there is an end of civilization mentioned throughout the Bible, and a lot of the verses seem to be about the timing of the end of civilization, or the end of the world, or the last days, or whatever they want to call it. And so they'll try to make predictions about when the end of the world is coming based on those verses. Now, I try not to do that. I've stated a few times, within 100 years when I think the end of civilization is coming, and why I think so. But what I'm going to talk about today is kind of more or less just a verse describing why we can be sure that civilization is going to come to an end, as opposed to when civilization is going to come to the end. But if you listen to what I'm telling you, you'll see that the information that's contained in these verses is a pretty good indication that the end is getting close. Now, what happened is that Jesus was curing the sick and casting out demons, and the Jews came to him and said, the only reason you're able to cast out demons is by the power of Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons. Now, the word Beelzebub, what it actually means is the Lord of the Flies, which is where the title of the book comes from, Lord of the Flies, and hence the title of the movie. It was based on that book. But Beelzebub is even in our language today. The word buzz, the sound the fly makes, is kind of based on Beelzebub, and so why Lord Satan is called Lord of the Flies would be a completely different subject for a different video. But what Jesus said back to him, we'll just go ahead and read. This is it's found at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This account, but the best one is the one at Mark, simply because this is the one that Abraham Lincoln was quoting. It says, "And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, he is possessed by Beelzebub, and by the prince of demons he cast out the demons. And he called them to him and said to them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end." Now, Jesus' choice of words was based on other events and characters mentioned earlier in the Bible. The word house initially didn't mean a structure made out of wood and stone that people lived in. The very earliest uses of the word house were applied to a family as a mother and a father and a child. And that was basically a mother and a child, and a mother and a father and a child was a house. And eventually, as human families grew, you would have the mother and father would have many, many children. Each of those children would have children, and each of those grandchildren would have children, and the whole group would be called a house. Eventually, the mother and father would die, and so, the house at that time may have been divided into more houses based on, the families of those children. But as time went on, a lot of these families stayed together even after the fathers and mothers died, and became tribes. And the tribes were called a house. And a lot of these tribes became very powerful, and so members of other tribes would come and join themselves to the initial tribe. So they may not have had any family relationship, but they just realized that there's strength in numbers, and they wanted to be part of a strong organization. So at that point, these became nations, but they still considered themselves to be a house. And so that's why Abraham Lincoln would refer to the entire nation as a house, because that was the concept that was in the Bible. However, the Bible always makes a distinction between Satan's houses, families, tribes, and nations, and his house. The concept, and I really probably should have looked this up just so I could let you see it for yourself. The Bible says very clearly in many, many verses that there's no reason for us to fight with one another. We all have one Father, that Father being God. Since we are all children of God, we are all one family. And so, this is a regular teaching of the Scriptures, is that mankind's nations are a fiction. We're all one single human family, and there's no excuse for us considering ourselves parts of separate families. That is all just a made-up thing. The boundaries between the nations are imaginary. The biological differences are basically imaginary. The languages, the religions, none of that really makes us any different than anybody else. So what we need to think about here is how this relates to the timing of the end. Well, obviously, from the very beginning, we had these families. We'll talk about one in particular. The family of a man named Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim was very early after the flood. He had many, many children, many grandchildren, many great-grandchildren, and as I said before, other tribes, families would join themselves to him until his tribe became so large that it was called the nation of Mitzrayim, but it's always called the house of Mitzrayim. And Mitzrayim was given a title, and that title was Pharaoh. Pharaoh is an ancient Egyptian word which means great house. So that's why I can say that these nations in the ancient past were called houses. So the great house belonged to Mitzrayim, the very first Pharaoh, or at least the first Pharaoh after the flood. But the word the word Mitzrayim appears in our Bible as the name of the man that was the father of that family. But in translating the Bible from Hebrew eventually into Greek, into Latin, into English, it was decided that Mitzrayim would only be translated as Mitzrayim in our English Bibles when it's speaking of that particular man. Whenever it was talking about the nation of Mitzrayim or the family of Mitzrayim, it was always translated as Egypt. That's just by tradition. And the tradition kind of has its basis in language, because in the Greek language, the area of the earth that was known as Mitzrayim was actually called Aegyptos. So Aegyptos is where we get the word Egypt. And since the Bible is in two languages, in order to have some consistency, there are nations that from beginning to end are called by the same name, even though their name in Egyptian and Hebrew and Greek and Latin are all different words. So who is this very first Pharaoh? Well, it's difficult to say because the Bible doesn't clearly define any of this, and because the Bible is just secular history. It's just like secular history, and in secular history, it doesn't tell us exactly how everything took place back then. But we do know that in the very beginning, a serpent approached Eve, and she was and asked her, is it true that God says you can't eat from every tree? And she said, well, we can eat from all of the trees that are human food, but we can't eat from these other trees, because God says if we eat from these trees, we'll die. And Satan says, that's not true. If you eat from these trees, it'll show that you reject God's law in favor of your own law. Well, that will make you a god. And yeah, I'm changing the words a little bit, but if you go back and read it, that's basically what he was saying. He said the reason God tells you not to eat from the fruit isn't because you're going to die. It's because God knows your eyes will be open and you'll be like a god yourself. And so here's the choices that were given to Eve. She could continue to be subject to God and do what he says, such as only eat these fruits and don't eat this. Or she could herself be a god. And so she's given a choice here, and it sounds to her like the better choice would be to be a god. And so that's what she did. And that began the very first political empire. And in fact, the Bible records that throughout history, Eve is always remembered as a female founder of civilization, and the serpent is remembered as the male founder of civilization. And in fact, if you read the whole Bible, there's a lot of stuff that is recorded in English in a somewhat inaccurate way, but there's a verse in the Bible that speaks of the world leader, the ruler of the world empire, as Lucifer. And Lucifer means the bearer of enlightenment. Now, if you go into Egyptian mythology, the very first pharaoh of Egypt was named Osiris. Osiris means the bearer of the eye of enlightenment. So there's a lot of verses in the Bible that confirm that Satan, the serpent, Osiris, the very first pharaoh, and Lucifer, the devil, are all the same individual. So the founder of civilization, without a doubt, is Satan. And so when Jesus said, a house divided cannot stand, he was talking about this world empire. Remember, Pharaoh means the great house. And so that was a direct reference to that. The very first family to come along that established itself as a nation is the same exact family that rules the world today. And just like that family, you have people who can trace their ancestry, or say that they can trace their ancestry all the way back to Pharaoh Osiris. And the first one that I know of that recorded this was King James I of England. King James I was the person who began what's called the divine right of kings. That means that all the kings on earth are chosen by God. They're set into their positions by God, and so they get to do whatever they want, because obviously God wouldn't put them into those positions unless he felt like they were the ones that should rule over mankind. And we don't know, we don't have written records of whether or not King James actually did descend from Osiris. But believe it or not, every single one of the presidents, with the exception of one, claims to be able to trace his family tree back to King James, the one who claimed to be able to trace his family tree back to Osiris. So it's not just a spiritual thing, and it's not just a political thing. This is an actual physical, biological thing that these people believe in. And whether there's any truth to it or not, they believe in it, and that's what's important. And so when Jesus said, house divided, in reference to Satan's house, he was talking basically about every single person who's in that position as the Pharaoh or the great house, the leader of the great house, the leader of the world, or even just the leaders of nations, not even just the United States, but all nations. And interestingly enough, most of the rulers of most nations are related biologically, not just that, like we are all related. Probably I could trace my family tree back to Osiris if there were actual records available to that, because we all came from a very, very small original gene pool. It's got to be some point in the ancient past when my ancestors were somehow came to be related to every other person from the ancient past. But the people who rule the world in general can trace their rulership back. World War I, this is how bad it is. When World War I broke out, I think every nation was ruled over by someone who was a first or second cousin of the rulers of all of the other nations. You know, eventually, it's like almost every nation on earth was involved in the war, but initially, when it broke out and there were only about a dozen participants, all of those were first and second cousins in real life. So when Jesus made a direct reference to the house as Satan's family, and he did it in a very obvious way. I mean, he specifically spelled out that, you know, the rulers of the world were the fathers of Satan's families, and that Satan was the father of all of them. Well, that's what Abraham Lincoln was quoting, and it's not like you can read that verse and not know that that's what Jesus was talking about. So in effect, what Abraham Lincoln was saying was that the empire that he ruled over was Satan's house. And there's no reason to, you know, to make excuses or argue at this point. That is the only way that this could be interpreted. Now, at the time, you see, this nation, the United States, was at war with itself. The Civil War was going on, and most people believe that that is the single most divisive time in all of human history in our nation. But it kind of is, but mostly isn't. If you study history, and you have any knowledge whatsoever about how the nation of, you know, the United States came to be formed, is that when the United States, the American empire, broke off from the British Empire, all the states came together and made this decision that they would fight against England. But that isn't because the United States was a country. It's because the United States was a conglomeration, a group of colonies. You know, at one time there was Spanish colonies in the United States and British colonies in the United States. I think there were several other colonies in the United States. The French had claimed possession of part of it. And after Britain took over, each of the states basically stayed as a somewhat sovereign entity. They all had to answer to the king, but at the same time, they all felt like they should be the king. And that's what drove them to rebel. You know, we talk about the tea tax or whatever silly nonsense they present in public education. But the fact is that each of the nations felt like they deserved to be their own nation, and so they joined forces loosely to fight against England. And the same thing after the Revolutionary War, the states went back to being what they considered sovereign nations or sovereign states. You know, the word state basically means nation. It doesn't mean subservient community within a nation. State meant nation back then, and it still does. It's just that in this country, people recognize that the United States, each individual state, is not its own nation anymore. But it stayed like that all the way up to the Civil War. People think the Civil War was about slavery. It wasn't about that. It was about whether or not each state was sovereign. Each state wanted to consider themselves sovereign. They made their own rules. They policed their own rules, enforced their own rules, and they didn't want any interference from any of the other states, which is what would happen if the federal government would take over. It would be like the other states ganging up against the state that they were enforcing rules against. The Civil War was about forming the states, you know, legally acknowledging that all of the states in the United States were just subservient nations or states subject to the federal government of the United States. So even though it could be said that back then that the family, the house, was divided, it wasn't really firmly established that the United States actually was a family or a house. So that's why Abraham Lincoln mentioned that. He was trying to tell them that we are a nation, and if we stay divided and don't have a strong federal government to enforce rules, that we can't stand. So that actually is true. But you know, you could go all the way back to the ancient past when the Babylonians were warring against the Egyptians and say, well, back then the house was divided. You know, this is Satan's house, the civilization, and Babylon was part of civilization. Egypt was part of civilization. But we've got something going on now that is unique in all of American history, and I think if you just sit back and listen to me and think about what I'm saying, you'll have to admit that I'm right. My mom doesn't have a computer. She's not on the internet. She won't have a computer. She won't be on the internet. So when she needs something she can't get at the store, she contacts me and says, can you go on the internet and get me something? And so I got her this. Plaintiff in Chief. It's a book about Donald Trump. And it's very obvious from this book that the man who wrote it, James D. Zirin, had an agenda. He hates Trump. And so he put this book together to make Trump look bad. The problem is that it's like what he did, it's not that this is a lie, okay? This is, if you look at it, all it is a bunch of information about court documents that exist, and they're a matter of public record. And so it's obviously that the information in the book is true. But the fact is, the information in that book is probably true about every single person on this planet who has ever ruled over a nation. You know, if you've ever had a job and there's 6 people at your job and one person gets elevated to a position of authority over the other 5, that person in general is more cruel and more aggressive and more selfish than the other 5, because those are the kind of qualities you look for. They call that leadership qualities. In the Bible, that's called evil. But it's a good indication of whether a person is evil is if they crave world domination. If you've ever seen a James Bond movie, in general, that's the defining character of every villain. The villains all crave world domination, and James Bond is sent out to save the world's freedom from these monsters, these power-hungry monsters. Well, if you look at how things actually work, it's not the empire that's defending freedom. It's the leaders of the empire that crave world domination. You know, these presidents, kings, popes, industrialists would all, you know, if you took their characteristics, they would more closely match the characteristics of James Bond villains than the characteristics of James Bond. And we're talking about a fictional character. And so if you were to go and write a book about the Obamas, you know, this guy, what did Donald Trump do in this book? Let me tell you, haven't read it, but my mom read some things about it, and she was telling me about it. And I looked it up, and sure enough, it sounds like that's what's in the book, is that Donald Trump got to where he is by basically defrauding thousands of people. And in fact, he uses the legal system to defraud 3,500 currently, or at least when this book was written. And so what I mean by that is he's got hotels, he's got mansions and airplanes and limousines and all that stuff. And so when he goes out and purchases anything, or he pays someone to repair anything, or anything, people that do any kind of services for him or sell him any kind of product, he gets a product, he gets the bill. Rather than pay the bill, he has his lawyers sue the people. So in general, he just is trying to get out of paying the bill, but usually not only will he not pay for the things he purchases and the services he gets, but he'll actually sue the people that provided the things that he gets in this, the services that are rendered to him. The problem is now he has a lot of trouble getting lawyers, because word's gotten around that when the lawyers send him a bill, he does the same thing to them. So most attorneys that work for him, they're really, really careful about every single thing they do with him, because they know they're stepping into the lion's den whenever they do any kind of a job for Donald Trump. So I tried to reason with my mother, and I said, well, in all honesty, you're mad at Donald Trump because he hires lawyers to hurt people and enrich himself, because he's an evil, selfish thief. And there's no way that anybody can argue that. And in fact, I saw a thing the other day. It was a T-shirt somebody was wearing on the internet, and I should have copied it so I could get this right. But it said something like, I didn't vote for Donald Trump because he's a lying thief and a crook and whatever. I voted for Donald Trump because he knows how to get things done. Well, this is America, and they're right. If you want anything done in this country, you cannot do it according to the written law. You've got to be a lying criminal, thief, crook, whatever, to get anything done. But it's basically what a person's saying when they're wearing that t-shirt is, I live in America, and if you want anything done, you've got to hire a criminal. And so that's why I voted for the current president. And that would be true of every president that has served. In fact, I think, I mentioned that if somebody wanted to, they could write a book like this about Obama. I think there are books that have been written about the Clintons. I think they're on the opposing team. And even though Donald Trump hires lawyers to hurt people, the Clintons are lawyers who hurt people. The Obamas are lawyers who hurt people. The most vile profession on this planet is a lawyer. And when I told my mom that, she goes, well, he may hire lawyers to hurt people, but I know that the Obamas are good people. They would not hurt others with their positions. It's like, Mom, Donald Trump's a millionaire because he's a crook. The only way to become a millionaire in this country is by being a crook. President Obama and his wife Michelle were both millionaires before they became, public figures. And so there's no, everybody seems to have their own favorites. People who kick back. I talk about Carter as if he's my favorite. He's seems like a nice man. He's associated with things like Habitat for Humanity. He brokered a bunch of peace deals that no one else was able to do. I just think, if I got to look at every president that's ever existed, he would be my favorite. But most people, they don't pick Carter. Carter, I think, if you go type in worst presidents in history, he's number one. He's usually, almost every list has President Carter as the worst president in U.S. history. But some people will talk about with this nostalgia about Ronald Reagan, how he saved the economy and he saved peace and he brought down the wall and all that. It's probably more just right place at the right time than being anything special about the man. If whoever ran against him back then was president, probably the same stuff would have happened. We're on a regular recurring cycle, and not just American history, but world history. So he's, I don't know. Here's the thing. Abraham Lincoln admitted that the United States was Satan's house. The Bible says that all human governments are part of Satan's house, and in fact that there's always been throughout the Bible a single ruling world power. The Bible was written 2,000 years ago. It was completed. And so we don't really have written records of which empires were the ruling world empire for the last 2,000 years. But pretty much everybody knows that when Jesus was alive, Rome was a ruling world empire. Rome was conquered by England, and basically the United States, when it broke off from England, was conquering England as well. So it's pretty obvious if you just look at anything, the number of weapons, the financial wealth, who controls everything. Currently, it is the United States. Now, coming up right over the horizon is Israel, because even though Israel is a tiny little nothing island in the middle of the earth, they seemingly control the world now. It's like the United States government, a lot of the people in high positions of high authority in the United States government are also Israeli citizens. If you go back and look at the rules that were made for who could rule this country, it seems to say something about you had to be a U.S. citizen, and to me that would leave out anybody that had dual citizenship as being a president or anything. And yet, that's not the case. We've got a huge amount of Israeli citizens that are ruling over the United States government, and that's the same with a lot of countries. You think about it, if a lot of the rulers in the U.S. are Israeli citizens, and the U.S. rules over every other country, by default, Israel is basically a major ruling force everywhere. But even if you go to other nations, like, all these other nations that are supposedly sovereign entities, they have people in high positions that are Israeli as well. So, that's around the corner, but currently it is the United States that is Satan's house. And Jesus said, if a house is divided, it cannot stand. Currently, this house, the United States, is as divided as it was in the Civil War. Just so far, there hasn't been massive bloodshed. But in the past, whereas the states would divide themselves according to this imaginary line, these state boundaries, we can't do that now because every state is at war within itself. The Republicans and the Democrats have never hated people as much as they hate the president now. Nobody has ever loved a president as much as they love the president now. I mean, my mom is not politically active. She doesn't vote or anything. And I can remember, from the time, the first election I was old enough to participate was the Ronald Reagan election. I was in the military during that time, and I don't know, 6 or 7 presidents later. I can remember my mom talking about each and every president, and when they would talk about bad things that were happening to the economy, she would always say, well, one man can't do everything. If he makes a good decision, then you've got all these people that have to vote on it, and so his hands are tied. What about civil rights, and what about overseas warfare? She always used the same excuse. She said, I'm sure that they're trying to do their best. She does not say that about this guy. She's just like the rest of the earth now, the rest of the United States. She has become so insanely divided against the people that support this man. It's like nothing I've ever seen. And I know it's not just my mom, because I'm on Facebook, I'm on YouTube. I get a lot of comments from people that worship that man. A lot of comments from people who hate that man. He's just another pathetic, lying thief, like every other pathetic, lying thief who has made world domination his lifetime goal. These people are filth. Their empire is filth. Their house is about to fall. If you want to do what pleases God, you need to get out of the house. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.